Thank you for coming out on this cold night to the Graduate Center. I'm Gary Giddins, the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography. As most of you know, the Graduate Center is a school of arts and sciences, a center for applied and theoretical research, and a platform for performance, conversation, and public debate. As a community of students and scholars committed to the idea that learning is a public good, we regularly present public programs featuring eminent thinkers, cultural leaders, and distinguished artists. To that end, we are pleased to present all this year Cultural Capital, the promise and price of New York's creative economy, an institution-wide public programming initiative that explores New York's creative and knowledge-based industries through an array of conversations, panel discussions, screenings, and performances. Tonight's conversation inaugurates the spring season of Cultural Capital. You can find more information about other programs in the brochures outside. Our next event is February 25th, which will feature the composer Steve Reich, who, in addition to conversation, will lead an ensemble playing his clapping music and mallet quartet. New York has always been vital to the creation and consolidation of the creative economy. When Duke Ellington visited New York for the first time in 1922, he looked down Broadway and he said, "Why, it's just like the Arabian Nights." Which brings us to our discussion this evening. We have an extremely distinguished panel. I'd like to introduce them to you. Mary Schmidt Campbell is Dean of the Tisch School of the Arts, a position she has held since 1991, and New York University's Associate Provost of the Arts. Her record of achievement at Tisch is extraordinary. She has tripled the number of applications and quadrupled the percentage of minority students. She has taken the initiative in renovating its film school, not least in the preservation of film and recorded music, and is a leader in providing direction in the arts that supersedes the individual schools of NYU. But it is her earlier career that made me think of her first and foremost for this discussion. After serving for 10 years as executive director of the Studio Museum in Harlem, she was appointed by the soon-to-be exiting Mayor Koch as the commissioner of New York's Department of Cultural Affairs, the DCA, a position she accepted in 1987 and held through the Dinkins administration until she went to Tisch. She can't recall possibly crossing my path, but I will never forget crossing hers. Her work at the DCA proved to me that the right person in the right position can turn a confused bureaucracy into an efficient tool for promoting arts and indeed the cultural life of this city. Mary Schmidt Campbell is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, member of many boards, including the American Academy in Rome and the Shakespeare Festival. Her books include Harlem Renaissance and The Art of Black America and Memory and Metaphor, The Art of Romeo Bearden. We're delighted to have her, Mary Schmidt Campbell. Jana Herzen came to New York from San Francisco, where after more than a decade in theater and performing, she helped to found Motema Records in 2003. 2 years later, she brought it to Harlem, where their office still is, and in the intervening years has produced more than 80 highly regarded CDs. Jana is a one-woman cultural brigade, a singer, songwriter, guitarist, as well as the brains and the muscle behind one of the best independent record labels of this era. Although it is devoted to a wide variety of music, it emphasizes jazz, and the artists she has produced range from veteran jazz greats like Rufus Reid, Monty Alexander, and the legendary Randy Weston, to Jerry Allen, Mark Carey, Charnette Moffett, Lynn Ariel, and Gregory Porter, who won the Jazz Grammy Vocal Award a couple of weeks ago. She was educated at Stanford and NYU, where she got her degree in drama and helped to found the Manhattan Class Theatrical Company. We're delighted to have her. Jana.
Thank you.
Looking at Jason Moran, I'm reminded of when John Hendricks was introducing an all-star group at the Newport Jazz Festival in the early 60s, and he looked at the wings and saw Coleman Hawkins waiting to be introduced, and he said, "The next gentleman doesn't need an introduction, so I ain't gonna give him none." But I am gonna give one to Jason. He is one of the leading jazz musicians of our time, maybe the great player of his generation. He was born in Houston, began playing classical piano at 6, while listening to hip hop, but wasn't particularly interested in pursuing a musical career until he heard a recording by Thelonious Monk. After graduating from the jazz program at Houston's High School for the Performing and Visual Arts, Jason came to New York, enrolled at the Manhattan School of Music, chiefly to study with Jackie Byard, who became, in his words, a role model for life. In the years since he made his first album, Soundtrack to Human Emotion, in 1998, he has earned unanimous acclaim, demonstrating with wit and imagination the triumphs possible in jazz, despite its relatively remote standing in America's cultural life. Jason refers to himself, or has such, as a jazz leftist for his stylistic inclusiveness, which became especially evident when he released his solo album, Modernistic, a modern classic, with a repertory that ranges from the stride piano of James P. Johnson to Afrika Bambaata's Planet Rock. Each of his subsequent recordings has been a much-awaited treasure, and there's one about to come out from Blue Note Records soon. Some of you will remember the remarkable evening when he appeared on this stage a few years ago. Since then, he has received a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant and has become an advisor to the Kennedy Center. Jason Moran. I want to begin by providing just a little bit of context about New York and jazz. For over 100 years, NYC, and particularly Manhattan, was the destination place for all kinds of artists. They could find affordable housing and places that the public could afford to experience their work. Everyone knows that New York was a center for the Bohemian poets, modern theater, the Beats, abstract expressionists, the folk and blues movement, among others. But to focus on jazz, this is where the jazz ensembles of the South became codified into orchestras, where black and white musicians could exchange ideas at jam sessions, even though the profession was segregated. This was where the profession ceased to be segregated in the 1930s. Stride piano was born on the West Side. Big bands were born midtown. The old school revivalists assembled downtown. And above all, bebop, the lingua franca of modern jazz, took shape at Harlem jam sessions in the 1940s. 15 years later, the free jazz movement was born here. And 15 years after that, when many people thought that jazz was dead, an incredible ferment of activity took place in the neglected downtown warehouse district, launching the loft jazz era of the 1970s and 1980s. In other words, in every decade, New York has welcomed, housed, and encouraged jazz and other artists until just about 22 years ago. And then things began to change. And the very places where they congregated became extremely coveted property by the very wealthy, who took the places that they used for performance spaces, and as the cliche goes, they gentrified them. I want to begin with Mary, because you've been involved on so many levels. What you were telling me earlier, and please tell us why the loft era was possible in the 70s, why it has disappeared, and perhaps what we can do to stimulate a return to that.
So it's a real paradox, because back in the 70s, and I see people who are about my age who can remember, New York City was on the verge of bankruptcy. So that meant that there was abandoned real estate, there was extremely cheap real estate, there were, manufacturing had fled the city, so there were vacant former manufacturing spaces, and artists could just squat, could lay claim to that. There was also a process of loft certification that the city had started actually in the 1960s, so that if you could demonstrate that you were an artist, and that you lived and worked in that space, you could actually be certified to live in some of these warehouses. And that was managed actually out of the Department of Cultural Affairs. So in point of fact, the poverty of the city in an ironic way actually worked to the advantage of artists because they had access to this incredible real estate. As the city got back up on its feet financially, these spaces, as you said, became coveted. Whole neighborhoods like Chelsea, like Harlem, Brooklyn, a whole borough, began to become more attractive. And as they became more attractive and the prices went up, the very artists who had pioneered those spaces found that they were no longer affordable. So I think we're coming to a realization now that whatever model we had in the past for the 70s and the 80s doesn't work because we have a different city. We have a different city with a completely different economy, and so we have to completely rethink what kind of investment the city's going to make in its artists.
Mm-hmm. So we have a new administration.
Mm-hmm. What would I advise the mayor?
Yes, listening.
What would I tell Mayor
It's going right to YouTube after this is put.
So in point of fact, the city of New York actually spends tens of millions of dollars every year on culture. They spend it in operating costs, they spend it by project money, and they spend it in capital development. There's nothing that says that we have to spend the money now the same way we've done for the past 10 or 20 years. We could step back and rethink how we want to spend that money. So I'll give you an example. When I became Cultural Affairs Commissioner, the city was just starting a Percent for Art program. And they said, if you are building a building, you can take 10% of the total cost of the construction and set it aside for an artistic project. Well, why can't we take that Percent for Art program and say, and you can set it aside to subsidize low-income housing for artists who have been certified? Mm-hmm. So that's one possibility. We have capital funds that we use to say, build a new wing of the Metropolitan Museum. Well, instead of maybe building another wing of the Met, we could take those capital funds and say, we're going to use them to provide low-cost or no-cost mortgages for artists who've been certified as
Right.
artists. So, I mean, you know, if you sat down, you could look at the pot of money you have. And
But you're saying the money is there.
The money's there.
That's not even an issue.
It's not an issue. I think the real issue is how do we want to reimagine our investment in the arts?
You've said that a lot of the money, or most of it in the last 20 years, has gone to institutions.
It is definitely going to institutions, yes.
And that would be the place where the change would come.
Well, you know, it's not to say that institutions don't need money anymore. You certainly would want to set that aside. But it means that if you're thinking of how can I support individual artists, in addition to institutions, it may not be just to fund their projects. It may actually be to fund them to have low-cost housing or even workspace, maybe subsidize rent for workspace, create a building where artists can get a very low discount for renting space to have a studio.
One of the big changes in the life of the jazz musician and the jazz enthusiast over the last 30 years has been the virtual implosion of the recording industry. And it strikes me as heroic, if not chaotic, quixotic, for anyone to start a record company now, and yet you've done well. Can you tell us something about what the economy of the record industry is in the absence of record stores and all the kinds of distribution that made it possible for over 100 years?
Sure. Yes, and it definitely is a little quixotic, what we've been up to. You were talking about games earlier today. Sometimes I say that Motema is like the best video game I ever started because it's always looking for that goal of how to make this really fly. One thing that, as far as, you know, you're asking about distribution, I mean, iTunes is an incredible way to get music out there. It's unfortunately compressed, and some people are audiophiles, but you can now get, you know, uncompressed audio at HD tracks. So these, and when I first started the label, we had our 10th anniversary last year, and so it was 2003, and I did have the opportunity to go to MIDEM, which is a big record label convention that happens in the south of France. And at the time, I just had Babatunde Lee's record in the can, and I was debating whether I would start a label. I really didn't want to, actually. I didn't really want to start a label, but I was thinking I would try and shop it around. But as I talked to people, I was looking that people were telling me that the jazz industry was going in the toilet, basically. I was told that by one record label. It says, don't you know that this industry is going in the toilet? And he had such a negative attitude, and I'm a bit of a rebel. And so I just thought, well, maybe people aren't looking at this from a positive perspective, and maybe there's another way to go about it. So from day one, I never wanted to call it a jazz record label, but I was working with very creative improvisational musicians, and they generally call that jazz where we were going. But I was particularly interested. I came to jazz via world music and reggae and Afrobeat, and so I first, you know, I used to be into Bonnie Raitt and Pink Floyd and the Beatles, and somehow I wound up meeting this world beat music with all the polyrhythms, and that led me into jazz, which led me into having this label, and has led me into really one of the most culturally fascinating adventures that, I mean, I'm constantly amazed by what this music really means. You know, we were first in a little tiny place on 23rd Street. Then we moved to a place in Chinatown, and then we had the opportunity to move into Langston Hughes's landmarked home in Harlem. And I often tell people this because I'm somewhat embarrassed to say it, but I feel like it's very important to say that I managed to go all the way through elementary school, high school, Stanford, and NYU, Tisch School of the Arts. I did go there. And I somehow had not been introduced to the poetry of Langston Hughes through that entire, and when I got offered, I went, Langston Hughes, I know that name. You know, I'd heard the name. And then when I checked out his poetry, it moved me so much that I actually started writing again. And I thought, this is an amazing, the music, the poetry really caught me. And then that moved me up to Harlem, which brought me into an entire new world, which is, you know, there is a new Harlem Renaissance that is going on. There's many creative people up there. A lot of people have moved up there. And so to answer your question shortly, like, yes, there's very few record stores, but there are enough that we still sell more physical product than we do digital.
What kind of sales do you anticipate for an average release?
You know, there's three kinds of releases that I have. Developing artists, if they're not touring, I'm sorry, but it could be as low as 200 to 300 in the first year. We have to go by the first year, but as time goes on, I'm in the business of investing in incredibly creative people who really could use that housing you're talking about. As a matter of fact, a few of them could really, really use that. I love the idea, and I think we should follow that up. Because, you know, over time, some of these people I really feel can be the McCoy Tyners of their generation, like a Mark Carey, or, you know, Jerry Allen, who really already had a name before she came to us, but she was not being supported. Mm-hmm. And we gave her just creative outlet and some support, and you know, we have a distribution network that reaches to Japan and to Europe. We have a very nice partner in Europe that really, Europe still does like to buy, and you know from touring. I mean, people still can tour there, but the economics is getting very, very scary. In the last couple of years, it started getting scarier again because of the airfares. It's very, we count a lot on CDs selling from the stage.
But how do people know about the CDs beyond coming to a performance? I mean, you don't have the same kinds of journalistic coverage that you used to have. You don't have the radio play.
Well, we do. I have wonderful digital marketing people who are getting the word out digitally. I mean, you have to communicate digitally. We also still, I mean, there still are the few jazz magazines that are there. I do want to answer your question. I said a developing artist might be maybe 200 to 300. Hopefully that will grow, and suddenly they have an upsurge. We have somebody who's, if they're touring regularly and we're getting things out, it could be 2,000 to 3,000. And if things really start to take off, like a Gregory Porter, which should take off for us, you can get into the 100,000, 200,000 range worldwide as you're going. That's between digital and physical, and that will continue. That will continue. And so it's our job is to find people who really can connect like that. But I also do have a commitment to working with upcoming musicians who are have an incredible vision. I mean, I try to work with people with a very fierce individual vision and an incredible artistry, and they have to have a lot of drive, and they need to do a lot of the work themselves too, because we're small, we can't do that much, but what we do is we help focus their efforts, focus their careers. I've actually hired managers, Robin Thompson and Mary Ann Topper have been working with us with helping people focus their business side so that they can make strategic plans, put releases out with a strategy. And that is what I think a lot of the record labels weren't doing. They sort of stopped developing things. And so that's what we're attempting to do. And I may need to go not for profit though, to really, we need to partner with people in order to keep this going, because we're like a jazz museum at this point, putting things.
That's fascinating to hear, because we have this recorded music division at Tisch. And one of the most attractive things is performers, young performers, want to come in specifically to do that, to learn the business of managing themselves, so that they don't have to be as dependent on, third party. But
Right.
that's an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, it's very necessary these days.
Jason, how important to the career of a working jazz musician like yourself is the recording industry? And I mean, I know that jazz recordings help get gigs, they spread your name, they are works of art, but are they still as important as a part of the financial aspect as they once were?
That's interesting. I mean, I have 8 records with Blue Note Records. I signed with them when I was 22, and I never made any money off of the sales of my records. I actually owed them over $100,000, just to be clear. Probably close to 200 now after this next record. But so I never was selling those kinds of units. I wasn't pushing those kinds of units. And the president of the label, Bruce Lundvall, when he signed me, he never said it, but I felt like he always whispered in my ear, we just need you to do the work.
Right.
And I felt like they had, you talk about this way of supporting musicians, young musicians. I signed to them in like '98, and I felt like they always had my back in that regard, and so that I never had to worry about that part about how many records I sold or would I kind of break even. It was never in my mind. It still isn't in my mind. I don't even care how many records I sell. I want to make the work as good as it possibly can be, and hopefully the people who are like listeners who are curious in that way will find the music. But I always say that this is my last record for Blue Note, because surely they're like, this guy sells nothing. He definitely, I always say that. I'm always positive that they're gonna say, okay, Jason, it's been a nice run, but you gotta go, bro.
But Columbia Records used to have an account in the 60s that if anybody's records went under a certain number, they were just automatically off the label.
And and then we think about a history of a record company, a New York record company like Blue Note Records, starts by selling these boogie woogie records because they see kind of, like the fascination with Meade Lux Lewis and Albert Ammons and how they play piano together. That's the very first Blue Note record, And they also didn't know the record business, They were just kind of like making sure that they were
European
recording.
immigrants.
Yeah, so they're just trying to make the music and enable the music in a way to get out to people. And so as an artist, that also is the chore, you know, to make sure that it gets to people. And generally, we do that by being on the road or playing gigs. You know, it really, that's where the bulk of our finances come from, or my finances come from, is being in front of an audience.
You're not expecting royalties.
Unfortunately, no. I mean, for the songs I write, my publishing of my music, I
Right.
get some money for that. But I don't, not for the sales of my actual albums, no. I never expect them.
I have this recollection of meeting the great singer, jazz and blues singer, Helen Humes in the 1970s when she made a comeback and she was working at the Cookery on 8th Street. And one evening I walked in and she was there early and she's sitting at a table and she waved me over and she said, "I have to show you something, you're not going to believe this." And she went into her purse and she pulled out a check for like $14.63. And she said, "You know, I've been recording since I'm 13 years old.
Oh.
I had the #1 blues record in the mid-1940s, E Babaluba. This is the first royalty check I have ever seen. I'm not even cashing it," she said. "I'm putting it right on the wall."
That's great, that's great.
I want to ask you about, more generally about the finances and the life of a jazz musician, but I want to introduce this question by reading my colleague Larry Blumenfeld, who I believe is here, kindly sent me an interview he just did with Henry Threadgill. And he asked Henry about the difference in the way it was in the loft scene and now, and musicians he admired, which he prominently mentioned you. And then he said, "I think it's much more difficult these days for young creative musicians. I think it's the most difficult period I've ever seen because of the number of venues and the amount of support is so much less. When I came to New York, there were so many venues we could work in and be able to pay our rent without leaving. We didn't have to go to Europe. We didn't have to go even to Boston or DC or Philly. We could play right here in New York City. Now the cost of living here is so high, it is totally unfriendly. New York was always, always a welcoming haven. An artist could survive here. When the artist can't survive in a place, that place will no longer remain a cultural haven. What people don't understand is that once you start running the artists out, they're gone. It's not just that artists generate revolutionary ideas, but that artists put those ideas into action and produce the work here. And now we have arrived at a place where the artist can't live here anymore because it's unfriendly economically." Now, you have twins, 6-year-old twins.
Right.
Your wife is an opera singer. You're both working in Manhattan. How unfriendly is it, and how do you negotiate?
Oh, wow. Is this therapy session right now? Because it's, but you know, okay, I'll say this, because I totally agree with Henry up to a point. Because when I moved to New York from Houston, I knew it was the most ridiculous city to move to in 1993. There was no reason I should move from Texas to come up to New York City. It always seemed, in my myth about the city as an outsider, it always seemed as an impossible place to live. I like to live with this many people on this set few blocks.
Right.
You know, like, it always seemed ridiculous. And so I always had that in my mind, that this was not the easy place to come live. I never heard anybody say it was easy. Not even Henry, who came from Chicago, and all the ACM cats. They didn't talk about how easy it was, you know? And they were fighting for other things when they were here, like just finding a place to play their music then, even though the venues are there. So then they have to make their own spaces, like the lofts, you know? So, and now when I teach students up at New England Conservatory, and they're in Boston, and they're like, "Yo, should I come to the city?" I was like, "Yeah, you should come to the city, and you should struggle when you get here." Because I said, I don't know anybody who has it easy here. I don't know any artist that does. And that kind of hunger that we talk about is, I think, the thing that attracts us all back to this city. Like, also, Henry is saying that, and he ain't left the city yet. Right. You know, he's still living here. I love bitching about New York City and still staying here. I love it. I really love it, you know? Every time I leave New York and get on a plane to go somewhere, I'm like, "Oh man, this is so great to be away." But when I get back to the city, I can't wait to be back in the city and bitch about how I hate it. Because I know it's also the place that has created I don't know, there's a different, well, there is no soil here, it's just concrete. So you know, like, but what it makes artists do, they can't really, they can accomplish different things other places. And I think for people who are curious about jazz and what it sounds like, they have to come to the city to feel it. It's just like, I think in the 90s, to live in New York and hear hip hop in the 90s was probably like hearing jazz in the 40s and 50s. Hearing New York hip hop in the 90s bouncing off the walls of these buildings was unbelievable. It was an unbelievable thing to feel. And I think people really clamor for that, you know, and young artists trying to find their way and have watched all these other musicians figure out their way of doing it. Because, you know, what, 1930, I mean, you know, what black people still have to mess with just on a day-to-day basis, you know, let alone play their music, that's not easy either.
Right.
So I think I always still entice people to come to the city from all over the world. I tell them to come here because I think also the city still needs that new energy of people coming in who are blind to about what the city has in store for them. Like it needs that fresh, ignorant knowledge to just come, you know, like just come in and declare new rules because you set a path for de Blasio for new rules about how to use money. And I think if enough people continue to do it, as you know, by fact of me even being in this seat right now and staying in New York 20 years, I think it's still the city that people should come to because there's only certain things that happen here. I mean, my favorite example of the reason I moved to New York City was walking on Houston and turning to my right and looking down Mercer Street and seeing Cecil Taylor playing a piano in the middle of the block. And someone had blocked off the entire block from Houston to Spring Street, and Cecil Taylor's playing piano, and he had a Japanese dancer, Min Tanaka, dancing with him in the street, and this was free. And I was like, well, this is why I came to this city. That's not happening in Houston, you know?
So let me ask you something about that. When you can't make a living just in Manhattan, you have to go on tour, you have to play at different cities, European festivals. How much of the United States offers venues?
Oof, I mean, 20%, 30%. I mean, what I've tried to do in my recent years is actually try to figure out ways of playing in America more. And that's an ongoing process. I think most American musicians would like to feel is like that you could play at home for the people But yeah, about 20%. But I saw a student in Fairway today that I'd had at Manhattan School of Music, and he's like 28, right? So he's the perfect candidate. I was like, so how's it going, you know? And he's like, you know, you know, I do gigs and I manage. And I was like, well, that's what I was doing when I was 28. I was doing gigs and managing.
But, you know, when you work a New York club, you work the best clubs in the city. You work the Village Vanguard, the legendary places. When Henry, Threadgill, and all of those guys first came, they couldn't even get into the rotation for years. They had to create their own places. So this comes back to the question, it's not just about affordable housing. How do we create affordable venues? I mean, painters had to have places where they could hang their stuff, and jazz musicians need a place where they can build an audience.
But, you know, I think, to Jason's point, I mean, you invent those places. I was saying before we came on that when I was at the Studio Museum, we invited Cecil Taylor to play New Year's Eve. And he showed up, came in and started playing. There was a Bob Thompson exhibition on the walls, right? So it was a beautiful contrast, just that. About an hour after he played, Diane McIntyre's dance troupe bursts in and starts dancing. It was the same, you know. And the point is that Studio Museum is not a jazz venue, but it worked as a jazz venue. And then when we moved on 125th Street, Pat Cruz started producing jazz events, inviting Henry Threadgill and, excuse me, New World
World Saxophone.
Right, saxophone, thank you. And Branford Marsalis. I mean, we had great performers. The point is that you can invent spaces. You were talking before we came on about there are still house parties, house events. I mean, I think that part of it actually worries me less, because I think if artists want to play, those who are their audience and their fans and followers will help them find places to present. So that actually worries me a lot less than them finding places to live.
Does it?
Worries you less than what?
Than finding places to live.
To live, yeah. I have the same feeling. I mean, we did when we were in the Hughes house, which unfortunately that fell apart because of one somewhat unsavory character who didn't follow the program with us exactly. But that we had an incredible, it just sprung up that we had this incredible, vibrant performing arts center in the first floor of the Hughes house. And we could fit around 80, 90 people in there, so it was a house concert. I arranged to get a piano in there, which made it something where Mark Carey could set up, kids. We had like brunches for the kids where they were playing music and learning, and we had from the kids to the grannies in doing poetry slams and whatever. And it's make the place, and then it did start showing up that people were there. Of course, it's still, and that was an affordable. We had an affordable situation, and I am up in Harlem where I wound up moving a few brownstones down from there, and I run it out of a brownstone, and that's one of the secrets to how to have a label is not to spend too much on your overhead of your basic infrastructure. It's getting a little out of hand for some of my staff at this point because it's pretty tight, what we have, but it's true that if people can't live nearby, and I'm running into this with some of my musicians who are just phenomenal and really having a hard time keeping it together, and it's breaking my heart, and it's making me go, well, we have to do something. Something has to be done, because these people make people very happy when they're playing, very, very happy, and they're also doing a connective tissue of Indian music and Indian and oh, actually, this would be a great time to show that little clip.
Yes,
Could
we
do
have
that?
this is a trailer.
It's a trailer. This is one of the things that happened to us this year. We put out Jameo Brown's Transcendence. And Jameo, it was his debut record. He'd never had a record out. He's a drummer. He didn't have any following. You know Jameo probably, right? And but he started playing with J.D. Allen, and they did some show down at Smalls, and Smalls should be given a lot of credit, I think, for really making a space for people to come and play downtown. It doesn't cost much to go and see them.
Before we show the film, could you show the album? Because those of us who did you bring it down?
The Gary Allen.
Those of us who grew up with LPs, one of the things we loved about them was the incredible art of the covers, which sort of disappeared with CDs, since most graphic artists don't want to deal with 3 inches instead of 12. But this is this is a Jerry Allen record you produced, what, 2-3 years ago or longer?
It's already 2009 that it came out, but the vinyl came out a little bit later. This is my first experiment in vinyl, because the album cover was so beautiful, I just really wanted to create a canvas, and it's Carrie Mae Weems did the artwork, and she's a very good friend of Jerry. And I loved the idea that we would actually put together the art of Carrie Mae Weems and the music of Jerry Allen, and Carrie's also a video artist, and we did a video that you can see online. And in fact, Carrie has a huge show up at the Guggenheim right now, which is excellent. I highly recommend that you go see it. So
we have to bring back vinyl as well, but that's another evening.
Vinyl is coming back. How many people buy vinyl out here?
Let's look at the film.
I think we have some musicians here today, amen. Give God a hand, amen. And I think I have a drum into this. Amen. If you could work without a drum and want to play the drums, you are more than welcome to give it a try.
When I made this one, I looked at it, I named Wonder.
Ooh, that's cool.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's where I learned it all.
Yeah,
in the big house.
Yeah.
If you don't learn in New York, you don't learn no place.
Yes, sir.
Like, boy, this is rolling.
You got to be patient. I think you should really be optimistic because you got something that's really great, but it's not going to happen overnight. I can't promise you X amount of gigs a year.
The reason that we're here is because something about your community is something that I feel like the whole world needs. And I think right now we're in a time of history where you guys have something that is precious. This is probably one of the most important days of my life.
Those are big bouquet of flowers you just gave us.
Yeah.
That's it.
For me, I think everyone doesn't have a choice, no matter what direction you pursue to go, you're going to choose to give yourself to some direction. It takes more courage, I think, to pursue something that is not right in front of you. That's where the greatest treasure is, I think, is found, though. Because I think that's where you can really find out who you are. I'm not even fully sure what the story is, but I feel what the story is.
All right. So tell us more about.
This is this project, Jameo Brown is a drummer, and he met the G's, he heard the music of the G's Band singers. It's a great story because he was writing his thesis on how the black church affected jazz. And that led him to do some research, and out of that research he found field recordings of these ladies with the quilts around them. It's the G's Bend Singers. And they had, didn't you work with, yeah, you did a piece on the G's Bend Singers, right? That's, you could maybe speak on that as well. That they toured these quilts around, around the country. And I know Jason did a work based on, it was inspired by the quilts?
Yes, it's very similar. So funny, I was laughing. But the Philadelphia Museum of Art commissioned me to write some accompanying music for the architecture of the quilt exhibition. And so also I went down to meet those very women.
Meet them.
And it's something about seeing rural America that was really beautiful. And to see that kind of work in its home, kind of like hearing Charlie Parker or Jay-Z in New York City, like seeing those quilts in Alabama, in rural Alabama, is really beautiful. But that becomes also the linchpin is hearing the songs that the women sang as they quilted. And it's just like arresting these songs that they created and these hymns they sang. So those also become the real core to the compositions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Jameo actually listened to the actual field recordings of these very deep South spiritual music for meditations in the morning for quite a number of years. And one day he woke up and he went, I could improvise to this music. And he brought his friend Chris Scholar in, who works with Kanye West doing all this sampling. And so they sampled the singers. And then they came in, J.D. Allen playing saxophone, and Jameo playing drums, and Chris playing guitar and running a sampling machine. And they created music all around this, and they brought in an Indian singer. It doesn't sound like it should work on paper, but it's an incredible adventure from the beginning to the end of that. And you know, as a record label, a lot of times I license music. People create this music of their own accord, and they get their money together somehow, or they get their friends together, they have their own studio. They record something incredibly beautiful, and they drop it, through the Dropbox online, and I listen, I go, well, that's pretty amazing. Maybe we can help you market that. And sometimes I see them live, and I said, it's the most amazing thing that you're doing, which was the case with these guys. And I said, maybe we can make a recording. what he came out with the recording, that's one of those days where you get, it's like a Christmas present from God, you know? It's like so beautiful what you're hearing and saying, I can't believe this guy made that, because it's so much richer and more present than what I saw originally, because, and he always said he didn't feel that he was really the leader of this band, he felt he was the guardian of this project, you know? And I feel that way about Motema, really. I do feel like I'm the guardian of this. It sort of rose up. I'm a musician, and what I love is this type of adventure. When I say that the journey started in the middle, because he heard this music, and it kind of came out of there, and then he went back to meet them. And this filmmaker wanted to film him meeting them, so I came up with a little dough to send them down there. And then he made an entire, it was for a demo, you know, but he made an entire documentary. It just filmed at the Pan-African Film Festival yesterday, and it got wonderful response. And, you know, that to me, I just love when people inspire each other. That's what I think is a shame if it gets so, I mean, a certain amount of struggle is necessary, but when things become really, you know, obstructionary, just like whether it's in race relations or whether it's in artist relations or wherever it is, if it becomes so impossible to even find a place to live, you know, it's hard to.
Let me change the perspective a little bit, because something's going on right now that makes me very optimistic, and that is that for, I don't know, more than 10 or 12 years in the 90s and the early years of this century, at the end of the year when jazz critics made their lists of the best records or the records that were most talked about, it was almost always guys who were collecting Social Security. It was the new Ornette Coleman, it was the Cecil Taylor, it was the Sonny Rollins, it was very, Sam Rivers, very often the older guys. And in the last couple of years, if you look at the polls, they're not only dominated, with the exception of an occasional Wayne Shorter, by younger musicians, but frequently debut albums. We were talking before about Cecile Salvant, who we're all enormously excited about. And there are a number of performers, there's so many really, gifted. There seems to me to be just an incredible number of really alive, original, witty, knowing, authoritative musicians. So what do we do to create an infrastructure? Where are the new festival producers? Where are the radio stations? Where are the clubs?
So before you get to that, I think there's a step back, and the step back is that I think somewhere in the 90s, there was a tremendous institutionalization of jazz, and some people didn't like it. You know, jazz at Lincoln Center, Thelonious Institute, Thelonious Monk Institute. You know, a lot of institutionalization. What it has done is really seeded incredible interest in jazz all over the country among young people, and particularly high school age. I mean, you know, it's interesting to me. My youngest son was in high school. Superb jazz musicians were his teachers, were guided the jazz band, and this is not exceptional. That you can find that in other places. The Duke Ellington competition that Jazz at Lincoln Center holds, where, you know, the winning orchestra will come from, you know, someplace in Oregon. You know, so in point of fact, I think what's rumbling in the background is a new audience, not only musicians, but a new audience and a new level of interest that is kind of borning, which is why I keep going back to the fact that we have to, that's why we have to go back to the drawing board and sort of rethink how we figure out the support structures for this new generation. So that was just the...
No, I think that's extremely important. The Ellington contest that Wynton Marsalis has been doing has just uncovered so many really talented teenagers. But, you know, I was just thinking Threadgill had something to say about that too, if I could find the line. Now this is a little counterintuitive. He says, you have so many people out here now looking to draw from these revenues and support. The schools and universities have turned out thousands and thousands of people with so-called jazz and classical music degrees that have overwhelmed the field. And these people didn't find their way naturally into this area so that there would be a natural balance. A piece of paper or degree is not the same as experience in a band or on the road or as a true artistic apprentice. It used to be that there seemed to be a natural balance, and now there's an imbalance. And with the breakdown of the recording industry, all these people are making CDs, and there are more and more put out on the market, yet there's no discrimination. So he's saying, you know, a lot of people don't like the idea of mediators getting in between and deciding this guy can play and this guy can't play, but he's also saying that without that, anybody with a vague understanding of the digital world can put out his own recordings. And does this litter the environment, or is it a good thing? What do you think?
Well, it's littered. We've been littered for a long time. Once you had a lot of cable stations, you were littered.
Right.
So like littering with music is like, oh, whatever. And people, I mean, you could probably count how many websites you actually visit, on a day-to-day basis. Like you go to your true places that you need to visit, if you have that time. So I feel like the music usually weeds itself through. If it's meant to rise and get the right amount of sunlight, then it hopefully will find its way. And but what I've been trying to tell students now at NEC is, do you really think you're going to be out here and need to be on the stage? And that's the hard part, is to kind of get out of the student's mind that they actually have to be on the stage. We need people who run labels. We need people who know how to book a band. We need a promoter. We need like a tour manager. We need a sound person. We need writers. We need people with really fresh ideas about how to look at the thing that we love, this music. And that, instead of just all performers, Bruce Lundvall, who used to run Blue Note Records, he was a saxophone player. Most of the people that work in Blue Note Records are musicians, or used to be musicians.
Right. But Bruce Lundvall, for those of you who don't know, he's sort of semi-retired, or pretty much retired. But he revived Blue Note Records, and before that, Elektra, and he did his yeoman best to bring jazz to Columbia Records before that. There are not a lot of people in the business like him. Now, you've said that Don Was, who has taken over Blue Note, is trying to keep it like it was. But let me just read a quote from him, which I find very interesting. He says, "The Blue Note strategy in the digital age is to play small ball, meaning to sell modest numbers of albums by many artists. Everything doesn't have to be a home run." Now, I'm thinking about the numbers you just gave. Here are his numbers. We're going to 100,000 our way to prosperity.
Well, I think if you're putting out Lucinda Williams,
Okay.
then you can do 100,000 as you.
But that's the old
Do that.
idea that used to exist in the record business, certainly in the 50s, until the rock numbers changed everything. The idea was, it was like the publishing industry. If you had best-selling writers, you took some of those profits to discover the really serious young novelists, and you published poetry, and all the major labels did that. They all had classical symphony orchestras under contract. They all had jazz divisions. They had spoken word. They had blues. They had all kinds of ethnic musics from around the world, until finally the companies were bought up by people who were more interested in seeing their stock certificates, and the owners could no longer justify recording music that wasn't making a lot of money.
I was talking to my wife last night, and she said, you should ask Gary. She said, talk about the Village Voice, right? Well, I don't mean
The late lamented, yes.
right, and like that, because that's also, like you talk about, like writers writing about the music in a way of kind of disseminating the information to a curious reader of a certain type that read the Village Voice. Like that also, I feel like, is a major part of it. Doesn't necessarily have its dollar amount set upon like how you get this information out here, but was a vital thing to rely on was these words, and what was the relationship when it started to shift away from that.
It's very interesting about The Voice. After I started writing regularly in the early 1970s, somebody there noticed that they were getting an average of 4 pages of advertisements every week that they had not been getting before. All the clubs, every time somebody put on a concert, because they can't afford the Times, they would go to The Voice. So that was more than paying for my column. And virtually all of us who wrote for The Voice, when The Voice was being sold, they were always doing demographics as to what people read. So, you know, most people would turn, they would read this political writer, or they would read the film critic. And as long as you were in the top 10 or 12, you were very secure there, because people were actually buying the thing to read you. But when The Voice went free, that all changed. Because everybody started picking up The Voice for the movie ads, the sex ads. The sex ads became the single most important source of revenue at the paper. And suddenly the writers we were like sort of filling in the print between the sex ads. So I mean, you see what The Voice is now, and then it was bought by somebody who has no knowledge of or interest in New York City. The loss of places for jazz criticism, and for film criticism for that matter, has been one of the really painful things that's happened over the last decade. I remember once, it was one of your albums, I had just done a column on it, and Bruce Lundvall called me up, and he said, I just want to thank you for that piece. And I said, Bruce, why are you thanking me? I'm doing this every week for a quarter of a century already. And he said, yeah, but at this point, you're all we've got. Not meaning me, but the print guys, because there was no commercial radio in New York anymore.
Right.
And as he pointed out to me, he said, you know, with commercial radio, I can buy an ad. I can buy a 3-minute ad and have it played, you know, 15 times a day, and everybody knows about it. And I remember as a kid listening to commercial jazz radio when a new Miles Davis record came out, and the ad was like every hour, and you damn well went out to get the rest of that record. He said, but I can't do that with a listener-sponsored station. All we can do is beg them to put us in the rotation. They won't take ads. There's no, you know, it's like almost he was nostalgic for payola, some way to have an influence on the radio.
So I have a question for you, Gary, and,
Yeah.
and Jason and Jenna as well. So in pop music, I'm told by people who have teenagers that their children get all their music from YouTube. I don't know whether that's true, because I don't watch it, but I'm curious, you know, something that's as beautiful visually as this trailer, I mean, is that a possibility, or is that just, I mean, the point is that the technology is changing the way we're finding that the young people who come to our school are just in a completely different universe from the one that we're in, and we're trying to figure that out. But certainly one of them is the fact that they depend, this dependence on YouTube in terms of consuming their music.
I once gave a lecture at a school in the Midwest, and they sent a couple of music students, to pick me up at the airport. And driving back, we started talking about how you listen to music. And one of the guys said, I've never bought a CD in my life. And the other guy said, I once bought one as a gift. How do you deal with that?
How do you deal with that? Yeah.
Did you ask them if they were buying any downloads? Because a lot of
That's
people,
what they do, download.
But do they actually buy downloads, or do they just download? Because it's pretty easy to just download. But I mean, we have a very heavy focus on, yes, putting up YouTubes. Like you put a YouTube up with the album cover, and just play one of the songs. And then if they like that, and you put a link, and our wonderful marketing person, Haley Bronner, has now, you know, taught me about Bitly links, which I wasn't aware of. You know, and I'm always learning from the people who work for me, because I've got the good enough sense to hire younger people. So they, you know, a Bitly link, actually, you click on that, and you can track how many times that, you know, people have clicked on that, and there's a site where you can track that. And they're small, because a lot of links are very long, and it makes a small one. It's really an important marketing tool now. And it allows us to see, you know, if he does this digital marketing campaign, how many people went to iTunes to buy it? And our iTunes sales went up 40% last year from hiring this young man. So, I mean, that between that and Gregory Porter shooting through the roof, of course, that also helped. So it's, you know, we'd have to really do the math to see exactly where. But I know that Fanny Del Sol, who's working with me also, one of my secrets to things moving forward this year was hiring a French marketing person. So she had lots of connections in France, and of course France is a very important place to...
What percentage of sales are overseas?
You know, I have a little argument right now with my overseas people because they're not sending me enough reports for me to really track it right. I'm expecting to get something soon because this has been a very big year for us. We've gotten a lot of press overseas, and this year our overseas partners, they helped us to put, because it was our 10th anniversary, we actually had cover mount CDs on Jazz Thing in Germany, on Jazz News in France, and on Jazz Wise in the UK, which allowed us to expose the label and the 22 people who brought out records last year to the public that way. And so, you know, things have, this year I'm very curious to get those reports. So usually things run a good 3 to 6 months behind in the music industry sometimes for being able to get your numbers, and that's not helpful. If you're dealing with iTunes and whatnot, you do have you can tell more quickly, you know, how things are.
We're going to take 2 questions. So there's a microphone on the side if you want to go up there. In the meantime, it occurs to me that the clubs in New York, and we talk about the jazz economy, seem to be booming. I mean, most nights when I go, they're filled. Is that your experience? And how does that translate to recording sales, if at all?
Well, I don't know about the translation to recording sales, but there's always been an activity. I felt, well, okay, I won't say that, but I've been in the club and there's been 7 people there, and you just play. But I'm also very curious, you know, not necessarily about those big clubs like the Blue Note, or those places are run also by, I mean, lots of tourists also visit the city, and
yes.
they know that those places are havens and they need to visit them. But there are places like popping up in Brooklyn, like Matt Garrison, a bassist, started Shapeshifter Lab. A dude, Ohad Talmor, a saxophonist, started Seeds, which is a place in his living room, you know. And John Zorn has the Stone downtown, and he's successfully been able to maintain this space very simply and modestly for some years now.
You know, you raised an interesting problem here. I was protesting for years at the prices of jazz clubs, of the mainstream clubs, that kids can't afford to go to them. They can afford to go to a movie, but not a jazz club, where when I was a kid, the price was almost exactly the same. And I asked a number of club owners, including Max Gordon, who said that the pricing that we price now, well, as he put it, the German and Japanese tourists, they can afford that.
But now there's a truth, though, is that one of the attractions of New York City is jazz, right, for tourists. And I don't know how we could measure. That was what came to me from thinking about this. How could we measure how much tourism comes into this city
Because
of jazz? And I probably, it's not huge that people just go, oh, I'm going to actually fly here for a jazz weekend. But you know for sure
I can tell
that people
you,
are coming to hear Broadway and they're going to see that jazz afterwards. And if it wasn't there, it would be, like Nietzsche says, life without music is a mistake. I mean, if you don't have a place to go out and enjoy New York City, it's not New York City anymore.
I can tell you that a number of times I've been to clubs and I'll be sitting at a table and there'll be tourists at the same table, and you know, you're a David Murray fan because David Murray is playing, and because they didn't seem like David Murray fans necessarily. They had no idea who David Murray was. They didn't know who was playing. They came to go to a New York jazz club.
Exactly.
And I've seen that many times. It's being in the place. I also noticed that if you look at guides to New York that are published in Europe, they only list the clubs that pay them to be listed.
Right. I mean, we had a whole plan that when we had that Hughes house that we were going to hook up with those Japanese tour buses and just
come through Harlem.
We'd show them a real jazz experience, and they come in and do that.
Question.
Only one question. I'm Sorab from the online magazine called Doobie Doobie Doo, and I'm a musician myself and also an activist. What surprises me that it hasn't mentioned at all that actually the difference of many musicians of this period of time is that they call themselves activists. And I know that Jason calls himself also kind of an activist because he's supporting the Justice for Jazz Artists campaign. And this campaign actually has started like a long time ago, and I'm always surprised that never in public certain people, certain organizations speak about this campaign, and I would love to know how Jason feels as one of the supporters of this campaign, and how he can, whether you could bring this campaign into this discussion, because you care about musicians. I know you care about royalties. Everything that sounded like wishy-washy is not really true, because you're a serious guy and you're in a position like you could talk even for musicians like who should be also here, like improvisers or electronicas or noise people, you know, who see and live in New York in a totally different way. I mean, they should be also mentioned because, yes, they hustle, they do the door gigs. And when Jim Owens asked me, hey, Sorab, do you do these door gigs? I said, yes. He said, how can you do this? Are you crazy? You're just exploited by the clubs. And so I said, well, that's the situation. We play these gigs, you know. So, right. Jason, could you do me a favor and let the audience know about the Justice for Jazz Artists campaign?
Justice for Jazz is, you know, we talk about kind of the health of the musician, where they can live, where they can play, where they can make their work. And Justice for Jazz is about trying to find a way for the clubs to begin paying pensions to the musicians that actually perform in those clubs all year round. And it's a major, it's a necessity when we think about the health of the music. I mean, there's this heartbreaking story about Dave Valentine a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times. It was just heartbreaking when you hear about musicians who have kind of sacrificed so much and really give over and over and over again, and those places that they perform at most frequently couldn't share a few dollars over years and years and years to contribute to their pension for later in their life. And it's one about making sure that clubs start to begin to recognize their power in sustaining the livelihood of New York jazz musicians. And also, I think to also then get the musicians, I mean, many of my peers and peers younger than me aren't necessarily thinking about that stage of their lives yet.
Right.
You know, it's that they begin to think like 40, 50 years, because our motto is we play until that's it, until we out. You know, we don't stop. But in case something happens, which it will for each one of us, then where is our support system for that? And so we're looking for the clubs to kind of stand up and try to support us as much as we have supported them for all these decades.
That's right.
It's a bit unfair. And of course, I still play some of these places, but I'm, you know, adamant about making sure that this becomes an issue that people are aware of and that musicians can reap those, you know, just kind of get back what they give, you know.
I'm sorry. Yeah. One more.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Jason, who, being from Houston, seems to know how to pronounce Houston Street. First time I've ever heard them both used in the same sentence. But more seriously, since it's been pretty well identified that the key to a successful jazz community is real estate, I'm just wondering, is the future of jazz in Detroit? Because I'm only being half facetious here, because there's pretty much free real estate there, and I'm just wondering, you know, there have been other fields where New York has lost its centrality, and you know, it seems to me something similar could happen.
Let me just close with one last question. This is also about real estate. We were talking about record stores and the absence of them. In my neighborhood, every time a store closes, it's replaced by a manicurist. I don't know what that's about, but there are a lot of those. Is there any way to, in addition to affordable housing, create rents where boutique record stores or boutique jazz stores that once flourished in this city? I don't mean just the Sam Goody's and the huge, there was always the jazz record store and two-story walk-up and on 48th Street and you know, sheet music stores and all of that. They've all seemed to disappear. How do we generate that part of the economy? In Europe, in France anyway, one of the reasons bookstores are still flourishing is because they're not allowed to sell, there's a limit on what you can discount a book online. That's the most pragmatic approach I've ever seen. It will never happen in this country. But is there any way to approach that?
That's a tough question. I mean, you know, books, in fact, in this country are having the same problem as you know, recorded music. I mean,
Absolutely.
you know, even a big chain like Barnes & Noble, you know, you just see it's shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And the growth of these mega online, you know, retail outlets, that's a huge question. I'm not sure it's just limited to music. Probably the answer to that probably touches on a lot of different commodities.
All right. Thank you. I'm sorry, did you want to add something?
I just wanted to say that, I mean, I had the same thought about Detroit, but although I run a record label, and I'll probably get, you know, shot for saying this, but I love live music. That's really what got me involved, and what I take the approach of looking at this and how can we assist live musicians in doing more of that? And yes, people want to take that home, hopefully, with them, but it's, I move more and more towards a model of, you know, looking for creating. I'd love to create a boutique record store and put the operations in the back and have a small jazz club and be selling records and you have to create a cultural community. This world is gone. First off, I don't think anybody has any idea how mesmerized and fixated we are on the dollar in this country. We don't know it. We live it. We're swimming in it. When you get out, if you get out, I've been out all the way out to Outback, Australia, and it's not swimming in that. It's not. And jazz musicians like Jameo, he's not actually swimming in that. He's not swimming, he's living in a small place, he's got his kids, but he's teaching. I mean, one thing I loved in the movie, and you know, I learn about this stuff by just whatever they bring back to me. I go, wow, I had no idea, but he's teaching these kids in the Bronx, and it'll break your heart and build your heart to see the kids. And I feel like the teaching aspect is what really caught my interest in the mentoring. And it is true that if you don't get that opportunity to get on stage and you didn't, I mean, we have a lot of people on the label who played with the greats, you know, whatever. Mark Carey was with Betty Carter and Abby Lincoln, and he put out his Abby Lincoln tribute after she died.
Which is extraordinary.
Which is extraordinary, yes. And for me, it's a privilege. I might lose all my money doing it, but it's a privilege to work with these people, and I sure hope to find a way to, you know, for it to reach people's hearts and enrich their lives in a way. That's really what we have to focus on, what will inspire. I mean, one of my favorite things that happened was the very first record that we put out. It was Babatunde Lee, and he's out in California playing his Afro-Cuban whatever with Hilton Ruiz, rest in peace, the saxophone player, Ernie Watts. And one of the people out there was standing by the door, and she's watching the thing, and she's looking a little uncomfortable. I say, you okay? She says, yeah, I just can't find a bathroom break. That's the kind of jazz we need to keep things going.
Jana, Mary, Jason, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming.